Generator was proceeding according to schedule, even though Bakra and Suzanne had been distracted by the ability of the drones to act as a portal to another world. The mirror ring was nearly finished, and this meant it would not be so long until the gravity generator could begin being tested, at least for short runs. Years ago, when quarks and gravelons first were discovered and understood, the idea of designing and building a gravity generator became not only possible, but also practical. And it was at this time when the existence of the asteroid was observed and identified as a potential source for constructing and implementing a stable gravity generator. In more recent times, Professor Alphonse Whittle of the Institute for Absurd Physics and Modern Dance had explained the physics using diagrams of electrons, neutrons, and protons, whereas the latter were composed of quarks, gluons, and triplets based on different combinations of up and down spin, so were electrons. But instead of being composed of quarks and gluons, electrons were composed of quarks and gravelons. And it was in this way that what had been the completely and totally mysterious mechanics of gravity became understood. In the same way that gluons connected and sustained quarks, gravelons connected and sustained quarks. And it is in this way that gravity pervades the universe, since, as is now known, the universe has many electrons, which even in what appears to be nothing, there is a constant churning of electrons and photons emerging into existence, for instance, in space-time, and just as rapidly disappearing, which led particle physicists in the 20th century on the planet Earth to realize that both literally and physically, nothing is real. And there are few regions of space-time where nothing is not real, or more correctly and accurately, is unreal. At one time, there were intense arguments and discussions focused on determining whether electrons were complex objects like neutrons and protons, or were infinitesimally small point-like singletons with no subparts or components. And until the now infamous "is it real" experiment was concocted and conducted, the prevailing thinking by particle physicists at the time was that electrons, in fact, were point-like singletons, an idea which now has been proven to be as goofy as rubber duck. The big question, what holds the universe together and makes mass substantive, was answered with the new understanding of electrons as complex particles, as were the equally big questions, where is gravity? And how does gravity act as the force that keeps the universe in balance? The force, colloquially called gravity, had been identified but not understood on Earth centuries earlier. And while the mechanics and rules for gravity were not understood fully, it had become possible to measure and predict the actions and consequences of the force called gravity. In the literally and physically classic thought exercise where an apple falls from an apple tree, it was realized that the apple falls due to gravity, and that this gravitational force was both consistent and measurable. as well as existing throughout the universe with known authority, power, and consequences. This was known, but at the time it was not known where this thing called gravity would be found at the particle level or what form it would take. In this respect, gravity was the most mysterious thing in the known universe. Even more mysterious and unexplained as what cosmologists call dark matter and dark energy, as well as what happens in the interior of the cosmic objects called black holes and white holes. Gravity obviously was involved, and the mechanics and rules were not known and only could be speculated, but not explained sufficiently well to design and perform experiments, where among early experiments it was necessary to construct long tunnels where the predicted effects of gravity could be measured, at least in hypothesized quantities, based on tiny differences in the length of laser beams. Something which eventually was done, but on such a minute scale as to be nearly undetectable. This is where the "is it real" experiment and its results provided the definitive explanation and confirmation of the fundamental building blocks of gravity and the glue that held them together. Instead of there being separate and distinct particles of gravity, the surprising results of the "is it real" experiment show that the individual particles of gravity called quarks existed inside electrons and were held together by a particle glue named graviton, in a way analogous to the way neutrons and protons were composed of quarks and gluon. This led quickly to a new understanding of atoms and molecules, which were known to be composed of electrons, neutrons, and protons in various combinations and configurations with different behaviors, characteristics, and forms. Specifically, since matter was composed of electrons, neutrons, and protons, and since the mysterious object colloquially called gravity essentially in a metaphorical way was hiding inside electrons, this provided the explanation for the way the known universe is held together by gravity. And in fact, it was the quark and graviton inside electrons that created and provided the framework